Multimedia, you guys ready? All right. So, welcome to our afternoon session of the last day of Thesis on the CBCS campus, or something like that. So Clement is doing his now. Clement is another one that I remember when I watched Clement's brother's thesis a couple of years ago. His thesis, he turned in a 40-page thesis paper, and it was like, are you kidding me? Well, Clement did about the same, right?
Whoa, no.
About 40 pages?
40 pages, including works cited.
Okay. Anyway, it's a great topic. Spent a lot of time on it. And so these are his words of acknowledgement. Clement says, I would like to thank Mr. Wade and Miss May for giving me the unfortunate opportunity to do this thesis and having the God-given patience to read my work that I submitted months after the due date with
Reservation.
Miss Christine and Mr. Joel, my fellow advisors, who gave me the insight of erudition, allowing me to structure my thesis from start to end. Miss Prue and Mr. Zorin, who brought order in answering my enigmatic what-ifs. The SORNS teachers, who listened and shielded me from the utter destruction of the panelists' questions. Speaking of which, I would like to thank my two panelists, Miss Riska and Miss Amanda, who've hunted down and spent their time taking interest in reading my thesis and in my topic. Moreover, I'd like to thank my parents, who brought harmony to my soul, my brothers, who've trailblazed and gave me meaningful advice, and of course my friends who've given me elation and the needed motivation to bring this thesis from the remembrance to the finality. Okay, I think that's all of the acknowledgments. So we're going to start Clement's thesis. His title starts with a great Latin phrase, Obscura Aenigmata, how to survive the next neurotoxin apocalypse. Give me just a second to start the timer, and I'll tell you when you can start. All right, you can start when ready.
My name is Audie Curlin, a researcher from the US, and to whoever find this journal, shall I reminisce about the tragedy of Minamata. 14 March 1960, Minamata, Japan. The Japanese Ministry of Health asked and commissioned me to research the unknown disease, the Minamata disease, that has been affecting the city and the port over the last 7 years. It all first began when two daughters of a shipyard carpenter suffered from symptoms similar to encephalitis, a term coined from brain damage. I came to Minamata by boat. On the way there, the color of the sea was abyssal black. There were carp floating belly up, and there were cats on the sideline, rolling around aimlessly and then jumping themselves towards the putrid sea. As I walked through the coast, I heard a child who reminded me of my first grade son back in America. He was crying within a torn-up house with several unresponsive bodies next to him. And to the right, I saw a man jolting and fidgeting on the floor. His skin was pale, and he was already writing for such a long time. God, I am just a feeble researcher. For what do I deserve to witness this broken creation of yours? 7 February 1961. I've submitted my report and published my journal regarding the Minamata disease. Apparently, a nearby industry by the name of Chiso was dumping metal mercury towards the sea of Minamata Bay. Symptoms of patients with the Minamata disease showed direct similarities with previous patients who were intoxicated by mercury. I hope the government accepts my suggestion and God save this country. The Minamata case was one of the largest and biggest neurotoxin tragedies. However, the Minamata disease was only one of the abundant neurotoxin cases due to industrial negligence. Hence, This becomes the sole reason why neurotoxins regulations become so vital for society, especially within our country, Indonesia. Prior to the modern concept of chemistry, alchemy was the pinnacle of uncovering the supernatural and became the source of several notable chemical advancements today, whether through the discovery of major periodic elements, medicine, or even simple theories that evolve into series of jargons that revolutionize modern chemistry. Yet, while alchemists were studying the concoctions within their laboratory, they failed to realize they were working with neurotoxins all this time, specifically mercury. Today, however, neurotoxins are mostly used within the industrial world as organic solvents or as heavy metals. Various reports have highlighted the dangers of industrial neurotoxicity, though there came to an issue when defining them in the first place. Based on an investigation conducted by the World Health Organization, WHO, they discovered that neurotoxins are particularly difficult to be defined accurately because of their neuropsychological effect and their property to accumulate within the body. Thus, there are still countless of neurotoxins we do not understand and experts do not know because they are left under research due to its experimentation difficulty. But what makes a chemical a neurotoxin in the first place? Neurotoxins are defined as chemicals that disrupt the neurological system and cause the neurons to dysfunction in a consistent manner. For this thesis, industrial neurotoxins are defined as chemicals that are heavy metal or organic solvents. However, is it currently safe for neurotoxins to exist within Indonesia's current regulations? Some would argue that the current regulation regarding neurotoxin in Indonesia is already enough. Adversely, the current situation proves the insufficiency of Indonesia's neurotoxin regulation. The Indonesian government and industries must establish stronger regulation against industrial neurotoxins for three major reasons. First, the general public and the government must be made aware of industrial neurotoxins that can cause dangers that are coexisting with them. Second, Indonesia protocols and regulations do not form a solid foundation. They create hazardous environment that threatens the workers' safety. And third, it is both a spiritual and humanitarian argument for industries and the government to impose neurotoxin regulation. First, I'd like to discuss the urgency for the general public and the government to establish awareness against the dangers of the industrial neurotoxins coexisting with them. Unlike viruses or infection, the effect of neurotoxins are inherently subjective and non-specific. Hence, neurotoxicity tends to be misdiagnosed. Thus, it becomes crucial for the general public and the government to set their attention against neurotoxins. In 1923, America releases leaded gasoline to be used for the general public. Despite its great success and being a revolutionary for automobiles, it contained tetraethyl lead, or TEL for short. Large numbers of clinical studies and laboratory reports showed that lead exposure upon Americans caused by TEL was associated with a wide and rise range of neurotoxic disorders and neuropsychological symptoms. Furthermore, McFarland discovered that children who are born throughout 1966 and 1986 showed major lead-associated mental illnesses and personality changes. He also discovered that lead alone was responsible for the loss of 824 million IQ points of US citizens in 2015. By continuously leaving neurotoxins around the vicinity of the general public, the aftermath of neurotoxicity would impact the public's neuropsychological disorders before they could fish it out in the first place. Industries greatly fear the uproar of the general public when common citizens realize the dangers of neurotoxins existing within their products. TEL Industries convinced the public there were no official documented cases regarding the poisoning of TEL, and those that exist were just rumors or cases of accidental poisoning. This scandal was heavily regarded as the most preventable public health problems within our time because industries trick the general public into believing that TEL was not a toxin. Point given, the general public must realize there are prominent dangers of neurotoxicity, and should not fall under the trap of a normalcy bias. Neurotoxin poisoning, however, is most prominently found among industrial workers, as they are the first victim of neurotoxicity. Because neurotoxins have discrete symptoms, industrial workers most of the time do not even associate neurotoxin effects with their work environment. Thus, this really brings up the question, is it worth the risk for citizens and workers to be subjected to neurotoxicity? The next proof I would like to discuss Indonesia's lacklustering of protocols and regulation against neurotoxicity. Indonesia is partly using the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO for short. The regulation of other countries who also use ISO, such as the UK's healthcare system, prove its effectiveness by showing a declining rate of solvent neurotoxicity throughout the past 2 decades. However, Indonesia cases are escalating because the Indonesia regulation and protocols do not have a solid foundation. They create a hazardous environment that threatens the workers' safety. Indonesia occupational law use both the ISO and internal protocols called the Keselamatan dan Kesehatan Kerja (K3 policy. Although these K3 policy are mandatory to be followed, the enforcement of it is almost non-existent. The K3 regulations are often mandated only by government inspectors or in-company employees, but never medical professionals. Furthermore, K3 regulations are extremely vulnerable against corruption. Most Indonesian industries try to avoid using these systems by doing loophole bribery. Hence, the layer that provides humanitarian protection for industries in Indonesia is almost non-existent and not reliable. The law and regulation provided by the government is not well enforced. Furthermore, workers who are involved with industrial neurotoxins have a higher risk to be afflicted with neurotoxin effects. To protect these workers from neurotoxicity, occupational therapists must come into play. Through applying clinical examination regularly, the workers will be knowledgeable enough about the severity of these chemicals. However, Indonesian industries severely lack sufficient neurotoxin medical screening. There are 2 major factors that dictate a medical screening in the first place. First is the budget, and second is the profession required. Unfortunately, Indonesia suffered from both stances. According to the Peraturan Menteri Kesehatan, Permenkes, there are less than 1,000 occupational therapists throughout Indonesia. Because of the lack of these occupational therapists, neurotoxicity incidents tend to go underreported. By allowing neurotoxins to be used without proper regulation and proper enforcement, then Indonesia will face the aftermath and risk the consequences of a neurotoxin outbreak. In fact, it already happened once. Around 2022, Indonesia faced a lead outbreak within their industrial paint, to the point that the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF, published a journal showing that at least 44.8% of homes were using lead paint. Furthermore, the market tests showed that 77% of them were at hazardous level. Moreover, UNICEF reports that around 8 until 12 million children in Indonesia have lead blood levels way over the safety limit. The lead case exposes Indonesia's negligence in industrial neurotoxicity regulation, especially when the International Pollutant Elimination Network, IPEN, was already warning Indonesia about this lead paint case ever since 2013. Even 10 years of foreshadowing and forewarning, Indonesia never tried to fix the issue until humiliated by the UNICEF. Furthermore, the UNICEF journal exposed that low or middle class workers were not following regulation and also showed they were not even using proper equipment. Currently, with the help of Indonesia, with the help of IPAN, has started to remove lead within their paint, even forming more restrictive regulation against lead. However, this is not prominent and comprehensive to all neurotoxin. Thus, there's no doubt that Indonesia will repeat the bleak history of another neurotoxin outbreak in the future. Finally, the Indonesian industries and government are both humanitarianly and spiritually responsible to impose neurotoxin regulation. First, industries are entrusted to hold responsibility with a role of protecting the workers and consumers. They must ensure that no workers, no civilians are harmed during the production, and human regulation must go far beyond chemical regulation. The Hippocratic Oath enforced ancient physicians to swear under the Greek gods to never harm the patient. Without this ethical oath, physicians will be free to uncover their thirst of knowledge, just like Nazi doctors who would conduct inhumane experiments on the Jews without their consent. Similarly, Indonesia and industries must do no harm. Without ensuring regulations are properly established or followed, industries are no different than Nazi doctors, treating their workers and civilians as nothing but a pawn for profit. Furthermore, in Mark 12:31, the biblical standpoint tells us to love our neighbors as much as our own and to endorse human flourishing above economical benefits. The verse says this. The second is this: love your neighbors as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. Biblically, industries must balance the economical benefit and the protection to care for both consumers and workers. Aristotle once said, "The mind is a part of the soul by which it knows and understands." With an impaired mind, so does the soul. That's why people who suffer from depression or psychological dilemma felt a sense of despair. Neurotoxicity introduced the idea that a chemical is responsible for these unwanted psychological effects. It needs to be recognized that the industries must be held accountable for poisoning the people. Choose flourishing above factories and choose people over profit. A government's job is to ensure industries to never harm their residents who are suffering from such effects. Humans are naturally selfish and indulge for their own personal behaviors. Because of that, the Indonesian government must take on the role of ensuring the enforcement of these industrial neurotoxin regulations. Yet, some would argue that neurotoxins today have become a chemical rare to encounter. Because of that, the Indonesian industries really doesn't have a reason to enforce these regulations in the first place. Heavy metals that are prevalent, such as lead or mercury, are now rarely used and have restrictive protocols already. And common solvents, such as acetone or ethanol, barely induce neurotoxicity. While it is entirely true that neurotoxins today have become a chemical rare to encounter. However, neurotoxins tend to go under the radar due to the lack of research. They should still never be underestimated. It took decades for experts to establish the dangers of one neurotoxin, mercury. And neurotoxins today are similar. Although people may see neurotoxins as a needle within this large haystack, but imagine if this one needle is capable of burning the entire haystack within a split second. This is exactly why Indonesian industries must ensure the enforcement of neurotoxin regulation and protocols. Other than that, some people may argue that Indonesia does not really require the money to enforce or strict these regulations. They could spend that money and it will be wiser for them to spend it on others' necessity. They need to expend additional resources for these neurotoxins regulations. Well, not only that, even a strong policy is susceptible to corruption. Although the entire premise stated by the counter-argument is entirely true, Indonesia does not require a huge bucket of policy changes. Rather, the government is authoritative to enforce these proper regulations in the first place. They have the power to control the impact of neurotoxins, and they need to realize it is them who needs to step forward. The reason policies are not enforced in the first place are not because of a lack of funding, but rather government initiative and commitment. Throughout this thesis, I've thoroughly discussed why Indonesian industries and the government need to establish and enforce stronger regulations regarding industrial neurotoxin. The government must put the effort into ensure Indonesia's ability to construct and make sure these regulations are enforced well. Albert Schweitzer once said, man can hardly even recognize the devil of his own creation. Imagine several years in the future, and Indonesia has not fixed the issue that this thesis has been premonitioning. In the end, how would the children of Indonesia face the neuropsychological effects of neurotoxicity? Industries and the government are murdering the minds of their civilians, and if we continue to be reckless against this neurotoxin issue, then Indonesia's future is no more. The first proof about the general public builds up the common idea that it is now only through the government action proper regulations can be established. However, in the end, the general public must realize their utter importance in designing neurotoxin regulation. Industries are always trying to twist the view of the public and hiding their venomous fangs before the public realizes. The thesis ends with the discussion of humanitarian and spiritual boundaries that industries and the government cross by allowing neurotoxins to be underguarded by their current regulation. It is an undeniable fact that the effects of neurotoxins have far surpassed the economical threshold. Even today, actions still need to be taken further. We as a general public must spread the dangers of neurotoxin among our peers. We as a general public must be educated well in order to prevent these industries from continuously tricking us from believing there is no neurotoxin existing. We as a general public must prevent Indonesia from the next neurotoxin apocalypse, and we as a general public must ensure the safety and security of our future generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clement. Good job. Our panelists today are Ms. Riska and Ms. Amanda. Let's start with Ms. Riska.
Hi, Clement.
Hi.
Hello. Are you still nervous?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. Well, I would like to give some of a strong point from your thesis. First one is, your thesis is pretty clear. It provides a clear persuasive structures. So every time you have an argument, you always provide evidence behind it, and then you always after that you continue with refutation and then conclusion. So it is repeated, so you consistent with your arguments, but it's not only your arguments, you also support it with the real world case studies, which is, I think it is relatable between the world case studies and your arguments. It is kind of like connected, and then these case of studies make your argument become more concrete. That's a good thing. That is the thing that I like from your thesis.
Thank you.
And then, may I ask you questions?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
So most of your research are from many different countries and different cases, correct? And then how do you think these international historical cases can accurately predict Indonesia's future, specifically for the neurotoxins effect?
All right, thank you for the question, Miss. I believe, if I'm not getting this wrong, you're asking that how could these case studies premonition or foreshadow Indonesia's fate if they don't allow neurotoxin regulation?
That's true.
All right. I believe that it really comes through the case of repeating the same mistakes. Especially, I've highlighted a key point that I found like a type of sequence within these neurotoxin cases. If I may, I would like to compare America's lead case and Indonesia's lead case neurotoxicity. Both have similar beginnings, where these people or industries would like to highlight that there's nothing wrong with this paint or the products or this gasoline. And then it advances to a state of where people foreshadow, where in Indonesia case, it was the help of IPAN, a company who back in 2013 exposes Indonesia about this lead paint incident. In America's case, there was countless of books and arguments, especially a famous book called The Silent Spring, that pretty much influenced the America leaded gasoline of this foreshadowing event. And then after that, neurotoxic outbreak happened, where the effects are shown directly. The lead-associated mental illnesses, IQ reduction, and lead-associated personality changes happen in like quite a long time because of these chronic neurotoxic effects. And then lastly, it ends with the government realizing and establish proper regulation against it. I believe this is the exact pattern, and this is how you could pretty much foreshadow how these cases could like foreshadow Indonesia's fate. Because I also think that if 25 years back, we could still premonition Indonesia's fate by just looking at America's leaded gasoline incident. And I believe I could say the same for the future.
Thank you. All right. So, still related to that question and your answers, in your opinion, what else should the government do besides implementing the regulations to prevent the harmful effects of neurotoxins? Because you said earlier that some of the workers or employee in some industry like didn't know anything, didn't have the knowledge
Yes.
for these neurotoxins.
That's right. All right, thank you for the question again. I believe the government should not solely implement regulation, because I believe with countless of regulations, Indonesia will still face the outbreak again. Thus, it should not come from a regulation standpoint, but rather an enforcement standpoint, where this government will enforce these industries to follow regulation. Furthermore, we could actually see this effect in America's industries once again, where the OSHA system pretty much ensured the workers to educate them with the effects and symptoms of the chemicals they're working with, thus allowing them to know the dangerous and harmful effects of these chemicals while they're working in it. And thus, I would also highlight the importance of enforcement rather than regulation. Without government enforcement, then any regulation is quite meaningless. And I believe that is what my thesis, really want to say in my thesis.
Get it. Okay, for the last questions, I just want to know what were the biggest challenges for you while writing this thesis specifically for this topic?
Thank you for the question, Miss again. I believe the biggest issue is really finding cases. Because as I mentioned initially, that solvent neurotoxicity is a neuropsychological effect. So we don't really associate with this like headaches, mental illnesses, or type of like retardation. We don't even feel it in a sense that it's like no one really reports or make really detailed research paper regarding it. So it's quite difficult to find research paper in the first place. And second, I believe it really boils down to like how I could word these sentences correctly in a sense that it could be persuasive and understandable for everyone. Because I believe that was a very challenging challenge that I had to face throughout doing this thesis.
All right, give applause for Clement one more time, everyone. So, okay, that's a good answers. That's a good discussion. Overall, well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you, Ms. Riska. Let's move to Ms. Amanda.
Hello, Clement.
Hi, Miss.
Thank you so much for highlighting this topic because this is not something that we think about every day, right? And maybe in the future, if you're thinking of starting a business that is related to chemicals, since you studied chemistry, right? Maybe you already had this like realization since now. And thank you for reminding us all as well. And my question has more to do with the regulations as well, maybe something similar to Ms. Riska. First, I would like to confirm with you with the policy, is it, do the policies have correct points already, or more to saying that did the government create a policy that's already actually really good? Or hasn't is the government not yet successful in creating the correct regulation, or is it the implementation that's problematic?
All right, thank you for the question, Ms. Amanda. I feel like it really boils down to enforcement rather than implementing these regulations actually. Because I won't deny that the systems they use, ISO 45001 2018 and PP nomor 50 2012 from the government and forming these Katiga regulations, I feel like these regulations are already strong enough. However, like once again, will these regulations mean anything if enforcement are not taken place in the first place?
Okay, thank you. And next to that is, can you specify the aspects of regulation that needs to be monitored more? For example, there are aspects such as the workers' safety. That's one, and then second, maybe the waste management. That's another example. Any example of the aspects that needs to be monitored more?
All right, I believe it really boils down to education, because I feel like an education for these workers to know like what chemicals they're actually dealing with. I think it could also strike two birds in one stone, in the sense that in one way they could understand that they're working with chemicals that could disrupt their mind, and they could understand what does it feel like, and how to encounter or how to do further actions without relying on a medical profession who will keep conducting medical screening and ensuring that the blood levels or any heavy metal or organic solvents within their blood levels must stay in a certain manner. I feel like that'll be too much, and it really boils down for the workers' education. And furthermore, in regards of waste, I believe that's more to regulation and more to tradition in a way, where I feel like Indonesian tradition of industries just dump chemicals on the ocean. I feel like creating this work tradition that ensures the safety and security of these industrial workers are at most important out of all.
So your highlight is for the workers. For now.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
okay. So continuing from that is, what if the workers, they know, okay, I am the lead content in my body is surpassing normal levels, and then what do you think is the solution for them, because they need to work, and then quitting a company is probably not as easy as as it is.
All right. I believe that comes down into how he or that worker is getting afflicted or associated by this heavy metal, for example, lead. It doesn't have to mean that if you are intoxicated by any chemical, you must leave the country or leave the industry in a sense. However, it really boils down to proper equipment and proper regulation to really ensure what is the limit. And I believe this is exactly like how chemists, biologists, in what they do in their lab setting. I believe they should enforce these proper regulations or proper lab safety requirements in a sense, in a chemist's definition, to pretty much ensure these workers to reduce the risk of this neurotoxicity effect rather than avoiding it entirely.
So it means that the research and the worries about people getting affected by getting toxicated by this
Yes.
neurotoxin is more on the workers than on the regular citizens.
Yes, that is exactly what I talk about in my third claim on my first proof, where I say workers are the first victims of neurotoxicity. And although they're the first victims, they could still undergo to general public, where the citizens are afflicted if these workers just do not and ignore these neurotoxins effect in the first place.
So do you have any knowledge on what kind of tools or what is it called, protection that is proper for these workers, whether it's like working with lead or working with mercury?
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I believe if I would have to answer that question, I would regard back to the SDS sheet called the safety data sheet that is found within like most chemistry, and where chemists and biologists, I don't think biologists, I think mainly chemists make this entire 9-page document or even thousand of pages document talking about how to deal with these chemicals. I would regard to that, but for example, cases like acetone or ethanol, I would definitely suggest to not use or work with them in an open environment, to prevent the fumes from being inhaled by the workers. And maybe for lead or mercury, once again, they should wear like proper masks or use gloves to prevent these mercury to go inside and past the semi-permeable skin. In a sense, yes. That's my
Okay,
answer.
thank you so
Hopefully
much.
that's
Wow,
enough.
that's very detailed on the explanation on the type of protective layers that people can wear to protect themselves and how the companies should also think about that and probably provide the fund for that. And then my last question will be related to the governmental issues. So you mentioned before that Indonesian Paint, one of the companies,
Yes.
it's banned. It was Indonesian company was shamed because of the lead content in the paint, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I wouldn't say a shame. I feel like that's more of my wording in my thesis.
Okay.
Because I'm just saying that it's only after the UNICEF, the government established these regulation. I believe humiliated is kind of a funny word for answering or filling the gaps for this.
But it means that in the international audience,
Yes,
they're aware of this in Indonesia.
that's right.
Would this be one of the solutions in pressing the government to maintain a good monitor of the regulations? Because so far we know that Indonesia has been so corrupted.
Yes.
I mean, monitoring regulation is something that's just formally done. You can just shove money under the table, and the monitoring gets green,
Yeah.
gets passed. So, what do you think are some of the ways that can press the government to monitor better? Because, the issue is, we know, corruption. And
Yeah.
with the issue of corruption still there, are there other ways that can make the government, push the government
All right.
to monitor better?
First of all, I would like to tell you that, or inform you that actually the government has started to fix this issue by involving the KPK, or the commissary that eradicates corruption within the Katiga system. So to prevent them to corrupt easily that much, or to really enforce these regulations to take in place. Because safety is over any chemical or really any bribery or such. And furthermore, I believe you're asking like, should this international be a solution? I suggest that it really boils down, it really comes down to the fact that prevention is much better than doing it or maintaining the effects during its peak or when it's happening. So really, it really needs to go with Indonesia's regulation first, maintaining their own regulation to ensure their companies and their people here is already safe, rather than always really relying on the industrial or the international companies to expose Indonesia. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, that answered the question. Thank you so much, Clement. I got a lot of insights from your thesis. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, I have a couple more questions for you, Clement. So the first one is, why are you concerned about neurotoxins when there are lots of chemicals, not just neurotoxins? When I was about a little older than you, I worked for a summer in a refinery, a plastics refinery, and things like phosgene was this gas that they told you what it smelled like, but they said, but if you smell it, you're probably dead anyway, right? It's that poisonous, but it's not a neurotoxin. So why are you only talking about neurotoxins instead of toxins in general?
All right, thank you for the question. It really, I think I pick neurotoxin because neurotoxin is like neuropsychological, the effects. So we don't usually associate the effects of neurotoxin with like actual chemicals. Instead of chemicals like carcinogen or like phosgene that could like kill you instantly, is really more prevalent to the fact that, okay, we must ignore this entirely. We should prevent anyone from being afflicted to this. Neurotoxin, however, is more of this exists everywhere, and this doesn't really show that prominent effects, or we could just keep it right for a long time. However, because of this long period of being involved or doesn't really get regulated that much. I believe that is where neurotoxins be venomous the most, because it really is more about the chronic effects caused by these neurotoxins that are as dangerous as these carcinogen. I feel like to really ensure that everyone knows that these neurotoxins exist, unlike carcinogen that could just kill you instantly, it's really more important to establish this awareness of these neurotoxins.
Okay, good. And you mentioned the American agency called OSHA.
Yes.
And OSHA is a super important agency in America that goes around putting regulations on anything from construction at a school building to those kinds of factories that use lead-based things and all kinds of things. But one of the things they do is they don't just have regulations, they require training of all the workers have to be trained by OSHA types of training. And then they have whistleblowing systems so that if you work at a company and someone is exposing you to lead or some other toxin, you can anonymously send a note to OSHA and say, this company is breaking the law and I'm in danger. Does Indonesia have anything like that?
Now, thank you for the question, and thank you for asking that question, because I really want to talk about it more. Indonesia does have a slight system that is kind of like these audits, right? These audits is actually contained within these Katiga systems, and even education regarding the Katiga about maintaining or training these workers is also mentioned in the Katiga policy. However, the difference is that Indonesian government does not commit or really enforce their industries to follow these Katiga system. And even if these Katiga systems are more to certificates rather than enforcement. So poorer or low-class industries don't really want Katiga system because they're expensive, and why care for healthcare if I could get more profit? I believe that should answer your question.
Okay, good. And you mentioned, mostly you're talking about lead and some about mercury. What other neurotoxins are out there that we should be worried about?
Thank you for the question. I feel like, once again, neurotoxin is kind of hard to be detected, so we can't really avoid this directly. But there is a list called the ATSDR. I don't really remember the full version. However, it's a list of neurotoxins that are prevalent and how dangerous they are, such as lead is actually, by 2026, is the most and top one of this ASTDR list. And other chemicals such as arsenic, manganese, and tin, other than that, they could also be found within industrial and also found within this list. So if you really want to learn more about these neurotoxin, you could also always go to that list conducted by the American government, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, very good. Your time is up. You've done a great job answering questions. Great job on your thesis. Okay, so we will meet friends and family and panelists over here for photos, and then we're going to start in about 5